Alrighty. Oop, no sound. Okay. Hello. Turn that down a bit. Okay. There we go. There we go. Alrighty. Good morning. Oh, one of those mornings I'm having a hard time waking up, so if I fall asleep, I'm sorry. Um, okay. So we're going to keep going talking about history of youth and childhood. We should, I think, be good to wrap up this topic by the end of the week and start talking about the cultural world of millennials and Gen Z. And I'm going to tack on a little bit at the beginning of that. I didn't even know that door could open. I'm going to tack on a little bit at the beginning just to give us a sense of kind of the difference between some of the generations, right? So we're going to talk, I've got some new material on basically all the living generations. So, and what they were like when they were young, the silence, right, who are now, mostly passing away. The baby boomers, Gen X, and then we're going to look at Gen Z, or millennials, and then Gen Z. So it should be interesting, and probably started out on Monday at the very latest. Okay, so where were we? I got this question from last time that I apparently missed. I guess it probably relates to this, right? This last point. That in the Victorian period, I suggested that a lot of upper class British boys were sent off to boarding schools, and then we get the question, did they get sent off to boarding school to deal with their sexuality by isolating them from girls? That's at least part of it, right? Not necessarily the entirety of it, but it's definitely a part of what is going on, right? It's like if you isolate them from, those influences, and as you're sort of wrestling with the idea that you have this period of puberty and adolescence, right? These recently kind of created concepts, you do get this idea, okay, we should probably keep boys and girls separate so as not to, give them too many opportunities for their sexuality to go awry. Okay. Did I end off on this slide? I think I ended off on this slide. Okay, so towards the end of the 19th century, right? The 19th century is a period for both United States and Canada, and to a lesser extent, I think in the UK in some ways, of a lot of social tumult. Actually, the UK as well. It's mostly, the shift to industrialization that causes all of this tumult. You get, right, moving to the cities, a lot of poor people, basically as the feudal economy basically goes through its last collapse, right? And that whole system of people working as serfs on the land, really kind of completely disappears. You get things like the Enclosure Act, in Britain, and similar acts elsewhere that essentially like kick people off the land. And, because of advances in agriculture, a serf and his family working your land doesn't produce in the way that it used to, right? It's no longer the most efficient agricultural method. So, everything goes through a bunch of shifts, and a lot of people get displaced from the countryside in order to support themselves, they move into the cities looking for work, right? And this creates, the kind of, Dickensian nightmare that you see in books like Oliver Twist, right, from Charles Dickens, and all of the book, what is it? I'm forgetting the name of one of his other books. It's not Tale of Two Cities. It's Hard Times, I think. But this idea of like industrial industrializing Europe and then a little bit later North America, creating all of these big cities with slums and a lot of poor people. And this is, the situation that Marx in particular, but then Weber and Durkheim as well, are observing and looking at and seeing all of the kind of social dislocation. So it's sort of the era of the birth of sociology in lots of ways as well. Okay, in the US in particular, right, through the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, you get the movement of these large immigrant populations from Europe into, North America, and into the cities in particular. And there is a ton of problems that come from this. A lot of, like I said last time, a lot of young people are kind of cast off. Their parents are busy working, or maybe their parents have died. There's no real support network for them. And so, they're off in the streets, either getting into trouble or, often committing crimes, trying to support themselves or provide, extra income for their families. So along with this, what I talked about from Postman, this idea that starts to come into the minds of the elites, right, of the middle class and upper classes, that, hey, we have children and we view them in this way as these, lovely, innocent creatures that need to be nurtured. So along with this idea and the fact that you're now seeing a lot of problems being generated by a surplus of young people, with not a lot of, of good prospects for jobs and wages, not a ton of opportunity, probably being mired in poverty, and therefore, in a lot of cases, turning to crime. And, okay, we should take care of these people. You start to get the formation of what we would think today as the welfare state, right? Just the kind of nascent forms, and then the formation of things like public education, both with the idea of, hey, let's get these kids off the street, and also, the industrial kind of impetus and the nation building impetus of let's instill them with values and let's, teach them the things they're going to need to work in the economy. Okay. By the close of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and I talked last time about the child-saving movement, that starts off in the U.S., comes into Canada as well, and you see it in Britain at the same time, of basically this idea that we need some kind of, state intervention to manage this problem of the poor, right? And, you get lots of legislation, child welfare legislation, truancy legislation, right? Basically the idea that students should be in school up until a certain age, and starting in the 19th century, it's very low, but it expands over time, right? So that by the time we reach the middle part of the 20th century, the expectation is that, anyone who is under the age of 16 and not in school is truant, right? And their parents can face legal consequences. So relatively quickly, right, in the span of maybe 80 to 100 years, you go from, no expectation that people have to be in school really to an expansion where every young person has to be in school. And it's seen as a moral duty of parents and society to make sure that happens. So much so that it's a crime if it doesn't, right? And I mean, this is still true, right? My wife, as I've said a few times, is an elementary school teacher. And if, it's a very kind of low bar. I think it's like if a student misses 15 consecutive days that are unexcused, so that they have to call the truant officer, right? And then basically this person has to do an investigation and figure out where this child is and why they're not in school. Most of the legislation is aimed at poor families. And again, there is this very anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic kind of tone to a lot of the discourses that are going on. Because again, as I said last time, it's a lot of waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites making these laws, and they view immigrants, the Irish and Italians, both of whom are classed for reasons that are weird, as not white. And then, so they're, Irish and Italians who are Catholic, basically they are viewed with contempt, right? And that's like, not to speak anything about like Black people, Indigenous people, and then Asian people who are also viewed with contempt for other reasons. Okay. In this same period, right, you start to get the emergence of psychological theories of youth, right? So you do get, people like Sigmund Freud, right, who start to emerge in this period. And some of the founders of kind of youth psychology, G. Stanley Hall, all of these, and a whole bunch of others, right? You could list them and it's endless, but they start to come up with these ideas about young people and how psychologically they are different. So kind of like what Postman was saying, as you start to explore the idea that children are somehow different, you start to find more and more ways that they are different, right? As you deep dive into them as a category of people, deep diving into children could cause them harm, but deep diving into them as a category of people from an academic perspective, right, definitely reveals things about them. And people find more and more things, more and more people come up with more and more theories about, what we need to do, how we need to raise young people. Okay, so you have a bunch of, things that the state is doing, right? Schools, you start to get a youth criminal justice system that forms, a probation system, and social work in its kind of nascent forms. So that's all in the kind of public sector that really starts to happen. Now, again, it takes a long, long time for this to kind of fully develop. It's not like when people start to think about it, all of a sudden you have a fully formed social welfare system. There's a lot of experimentation. And if let's say you go take, SOC 321, which is Youth, Crime, and Society, right? When you begin that course, I know because I taught it, you start to learn about the fact that, the development of the youth criminal justice system is this kind of experimental thing. It's like what works, so there's a lot of experimentation before we get to the form of kind of the youth kind of social welfare structures that we have in place today. And even today, right, they're constantly changing, new things are coming in. So we're not at the end of this process. So the state is really involved, state intervention is really core, but you also start to get things happening in the private sector, right? I guess you wouldn't say the private sector, but civil society. Let's call it civil society because that's probably a more correct term. So you get things, and really kind of famously, some of the things that you'll get in this era, right, are the foundation of groups that are tailored at young people that are meant, and especially poor young people, again, that are meant to instill values, teach them skills, right? The Boy Scouts are probably Boy Scouts of America, that kind of civil society movement. So again, not part of the state. This is something that's done as charities, right, as part of civil society, as institutions outside of the state. The Boy Scouts, right, at their founding, it's all about, helping young boys, especially those that might not have great examples at home, right? Alcoholic parents, absent parents, parents who have died, especially dads, to become, young men with good values. And, this idea of taking them out camping and teaching them wilderness skills and survival skills is all about kind of building them up, giving them good role models, giving them, ways of being in the world that are appropriate and that are going to be socially constructive, right? So there's this idea, okay, there's young people, that are not receiving this at home, so civil society has to step in and do that. And these kinds of groups really proliferate, right? Okay, obviously you get, the girl guides, and all of the associated things along with that. You get like 4-H clubs, you get boys and girls clubs, right? The origins of things like big brothers and big sisters is kind of in a lot of these movements. On the religious level, you have different kinds of religious groups that found similar sorts of movements, right? I can't remember what it is in the Protestant space. I know like in the Catholic space, the Knights of Columbus, this very large fraternal Catholic organization, forms what they call the Squires, which are their kind of youth arm to bring young men into this group and again, connect them with role models. So you get all of this, basically trying to form people up with good values, teach them skills, all these things, trying to get them, to stay in school so that they keep getting educated and move away, especially out of poverty. So this kind of combines with an increasing focus from the state too on education, particularly in the 20th century and especially in the post-war movement. There's this sort of real push to get people into professionalized programs, right? So at least, you want to get people a high school education, so that those basic skills, but increasingly as they go forward, more and more focus comes on post-secondary education. We'll talk about that when we talk about education a little bit. But this focus on keeping people in the education system, has these two as well, right? Values and poverty alleviation, right? Especially in the post-World War II period, there's a big focus on getting people who are still living in the countryside and farming off the farms into the cities, doing kind of either blue or white collar jobs. Okay, I want to check if there's any questions. No more questions. Perfect. Wow. Sorry, I didn't see you there. You're in my blind spot. Fire away.
I'm just wondering where the text for, I think it's TYYSKA, I don't know how to say that, but I'm just wondering where the reading is for that.
I think it's the first it's like history of, I can't remember what it is, but it's the textbook.
Oh, okay.
It's the textbook, right? It's that blue textbook that I showed at the beginning of the course. But yeah, it's the textbook that's assigned, and like I said, sort of optional. What you need for test purposes is all here. But yeah, that's where it is. I didn't post that one online because I don't have, I can't post the textbook online. But there is copies on hold in the library, I believe, and they're in the bookstore as well. Okay. Other questions? How are we doing? What time? Wow, 10:15. How fast the time goes on a Wednesday morning. How are we doing? Yeah, please. Oh, truancy. So basically, right, a kid who is not attending school, right, because it's basically legally mandated in Canada today, and like I said, this is shifted around, that you have to be in school until you're 16, right? At 16 years old, you can officially drop out of school, but until then, you aren't able to. And a child who isn't attending school and doesn't have an excused absence is said to be truant, right? So the laws around truant, like not attending school, not fulfilling that legal obligation. So the truancy laws basically mandate all of this and say, under what circumstances you can be in school, what counts as, being excused. Like if you're ill and your parent calls the school, you're not truant. But if you just disappear and no one tells the school, eventually, about 3 weeks in, they're going to report you as truant. So, and then the cops show up as the whole thing. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, please, Izzy. It's Izzy, right? Okay, cool.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering, because when you're talking about like scouts and girl guides and stuff like that, it
Yeah.
seems like it's very much like a social welfare project. But I'm wondering if now that has moved more into the private sector, where parents then like run.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has changed, right, since the origins of these movements, right? And in the beginning, yeah, it's very much this kind of, in a sense, social welfare done in kind of the private sphere or civil society. I mean, today, it's all kind of collapsing, right? All these civil society groups are kind of falling apart. Like things like enrollment in the Boy Scouts is way down. Same thing with, or I guess it's now just the Scouts because they took the boy part out and anyone can join the Scouts. I don't even know if, I'm assuming Girl Guides still exists, but I have absolutely no idea. I know my sister did it, but that was like 25 years ago, so I have no idea if they're still around. And yeah, a lot of this has now shifted really into the private sphere, and more, it's gotten more expensive, it's gotten less charitable, it's much more, how should I put this, pay to play, right, than it used to be, right? And all of these things have gotten really, really expensive as, some of the charitable foundations that used to support these movements have sort of disappeared or moved on. Or I think even like, I can't remember what the name of the group was. I think it was like the Canadian Women's Society of Edmonton, used to give money from their membership fees to the Girl Scouts, right, to basically, or Girl Guides to support their projects. And that group essentially folded about 7 years ago, because they were just like, well, all of them were in their 70s, and they said, we just don't want to do this anymore, and no one joined. So, they disbanded it and gave all the rest of their money away. But yeah, a lot of this stuff is now really pay to play, right? It's like and so it's become much more middle class too, right? It's become, or religious, right? It's become middle class or religious. I know the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, I shouldn't be mean to the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints, LDS is what they prefer, have their own kind of like separate wild wilderness adventure kind of movement. Um, and they've done this specifically. Anyway, it doesn't matter. There's been some political reasons they've done it, but yeah, it's really become this thing where it's very much middle class if you can pay to get your kids in there. But that's the funny thing, right? They used to be for the poor, so that they would have all of these great experiences, and increasingly that's all but disappeared, right? It still exists, right? But even things like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club, it still exists, but I would say they're kind of limping along, and they're not as prominent as they used to be. Yeah, please.
Since this was like a lower class movement, I guess for like lower classes,
Yeah.
was there an upper class equivalent, and was there like stigma around it at all, or was it like everybody agreed that this was a positive thing for society?
Yeah, everybody more or less agreed that this was a positive thing for society, providing young people with guidance and wilderness skills. And so there wasn't, as far as I remember, from what I've read about it, really much of a stigma. And it expanded relatively rapidly, right? As people, saw the value of it, you started to get middle class kids getting attached to it as well. Now, the way that like the Scout movement in particular always worked was that it's sort of almost like local clubs, right? So like at your local club that was in the, I don't know, community league, they would meet in the community league, right? Obviously, these were all communities that tended to be kind of class segregated, right? So I don't know, I'm trying to think of Edmonton, and I'm like, I don't remember, like, I don't think they have a community league, but let's say like in the West End, the country club, right, would have had their own scout group, and would have been all kids from the country club or Windermere or whatever, right? And they would have all been middle or upper class, right? Whereas if you went, say, I don't know, trying to think Edmonton neighborhoods, like somewhere like Bonnie Doon, right? It would have been much more poor, a little bit more mixed, but they all would have been kind of in community and run by community members. So they existed in different places, but it wasn't like if you were doing, say, you were a scout here, you were mixing with people of different socioeconomic classes for the most part, because it was pretty much like, charity over here, middle class over here, and never the twain should be. And there were obviously, inequalities there too in terms of like services provided. Obviously the middle class ones could be like, yes, bigger, funner camping trips and things like that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so nothing's perfect, but it's definitely there. Yeah, please, in the back.
So when it talks about legislation that came to poor families, was like the intention to help the poor families, or was it more like treating them as potential criminals, so they're more just like, let's protect our own like higher class sector of people?
If I just say yes, could I get away with that? It's a little bit of both. There's definitely the intentions are complex, right? And I think if you looked at the people who were doing it, like they would have seen their own motives as pure, right? Like, we're going to help these poor children with their terrible parents who are, there's all sorts of like ethnic bias in here. Like the Irish, that they just can't stop having kids. Why do they have like 12 children? Oh my God, what's wrong with them? We need to save them from themselves, right? So there's a lot of that. I think the intention is ultimately to help people, but it often goes about it in a very punitive way, right? And like a lot of legislation, right? Legislation's good at punishing people. It's not necessarily good at rewarding good behavior. It's good at punishing bad behavior, as it's defined by, whoever's writing the legislation. And I think that's kind of how it plays out, right? Is a lot of like, oh, you poor, stupid people. Let the state come in and show you how to do things. And so, yeah, there is a lot of like, okay, I'll give you an example. We'll talk about it when we get to crime later in the course. The first piece of youth criminal justice legislation in Canada, which is called the Juvenile Delinquents Act, right? What a name. Sets it up right there, right? Then later legislation is more like young offenders and youth criminal justice, right? But the first one's the JDA, Juvenile Delinquents Act. For like one of the things that it does, which is really weird, right, is once a young person enters that criminal justice system, they have there's no terms, right? So basically, they can be kept under the supervision of the court and the probation system from whenever they committed the crime all the way until they reach adulthood, entirely at the discretion of the court. So there were some young people that honestly, might have committed a crime when they were 13, and then would have had 5 years where they were on probation in reformatory schools or industrial schools, kind of because they went back to the judge. They didn't have legal representation because the JDA said, kids don't really need legal representation. And so they were just kept in the youth criminal justice system for all of that period. So it's like they thought they were helping, but they're also kind of creating this, long-term incarcerated or semi-incarcerated person. So does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. Sorry, it's a long and complex question. Answer to a simple question. Like all my answers are rambling and semi-coherent. Because it's 10 a.m. and I need 8 more cups of coffee. Any other questions? They're good questions. Okay. No, going once. We'll get. Hang on. No other questions. Okay. Sorry, I'm gonna give you like an epileptic seizure. That's my goal. Just flip back and forth between slides. Okay. Yeah, the 20th century, the middle part, early to middle part of the 20th century, is a real inflection point as well. How to put this? There was a real sense, right, coming through, the 19th century, even with all of the social dislocation, all of the social problems, of immense progress, right? That ultimately, society was transforming for the better, right? Everything was getting much better, even though, these huge cities sprung up essentially out of nowhere. Living standards through the 19th century do start to rise. It's slow, but life is kind of getting better. And there's this real sense that, the application of reason and science is building a much better world for people. It's a period, there's kind of on and off military conflict between some of the great powers, but mostly, the period from the end of the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century, through until the beginning part of the 20th century, it isn't marked by any really major military conflicts, like skirmishes, small wars between powers, but nothing explodes into kind of a really, really major conflict until you get obviously to the 1910s, right? 1914, and the beginning of the First World War, right? So what happens? Obviously, it is the largest war in history up until that point, and it will remain so until the next World War. So it doesn't get to hold that record for very long. And the First World War causes just an absolute ton of social dislocation, right? Enormous numbers of men, from all of the European countries go off to fight in this war. Two of the major empires of the period disappear. So Austria-Hungary, or the Habsburg Empire, basically disappears, and the Russian Empire disappears and is sort of replaced by the USSR, right, the Soviet Union. So it's a period of enormous kind of political change. The First World War is also this really, really weird cultural inflection point. And you really notice it if you go back and read books from the period, right? Especially that period right after. It really wrecks this idea of progress. Because, right, what happens in the First World War is that all of this technological progress that had been, put in service of making better, cheaper shirts and shoes and, cars and all of that stuff gets put to another purpose in the First World War, which is, just killing as many people as physically possible, right? So you get, I guess some of these have been around for a while, but things like the Gatling gun, this really rapid fire machine gun that could just mow people down. Advances in artillery, right? Artillery becomes super important in the First World War. And then things like chemical weapons, the first development of things like mustard gas and chlorine gas as weapons comes in the First World War. So what you get, right, is people, and it's horrible, right? 20 million people die in the First World War. It wrecks good chunks of Europe, and it is a super traumatic cultural event. And you get in this period, of the war, what's called often the lost generation, right? So this generation of young people who went off and fought in the First World War are really, they come back and they just don't know what to do, right? They come back into a world as well, they come back, the 1920s go really well, the 1930s go really, really poorly for them. And there's just this kind of real questioning of, the progress of the world and how it's actually panned out. Now, yeah, a lot of them ultimately have things like, PTSD. So alcohol and drug use is rampant in a lot of people in the lost generation, many of whom never recover. And then, they get kind of a period of respite in the 1920s, which are sometimes called the Roaring Twenties. And then in the 1930s, they get the Great Depression, right? Wherein, they kind of have to survive through a period where essentially all economic progress, a lot of it is rolled back and sort of disappears. And so a lot of them kind of struggle with what's happening. You also get, in a lot of ways, the beginnings of a questioning of, the kind of different gender roles. Because what happened, right, especially, this happens a little bit more in the Second World War, but in the First World War period, with all of the men going off to war, not all of them, but many of them going off to war, basically the state enlists a lot of women to go work in factories and to keep production going to supply the war effort, right? So women get their first experience of like making really good wages out in the workplace and being able to support themselves. And this is pretty transformative. It kind of never quite goes away, right? In the 1950s, women will go back into the domestic sphere a little bit, but this memory of what it was like for women to have, economic independence, aside from kind of their, not having to depend on fathers or husbands, is really transformative, and it shapes generations to come. And the seeds of thought that are planted here end up becoming really prominent in the silent generation, right? So the next generation after the loss is what's called the greatest generation. They're the ones who fight in World War II. And then it's the silent generation, those born, I think the dates are like between 1926 and 1944. The ideas that are kind of planted in this period affect the silent generation in major ways and will have massively transformative effects on society. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay. So, right, the Depression is obviously a terrible period. Youth unemployment soars into the 50% range in the US and Canada, right? It's not a period of a lot of opportunity, and things are really, really hard. The birth cohort, the silents that are born mostly during this period, is one of the smallest birth cohorts that they had seen up till that point, because when people have no money, they go to whatever means they can to not have babies, right? Because babies make things a lot harder. Okay, following the Second World War, a lot of things happen, and it's another really transformative period. And I'll talk about the silents, probably starting next class. They're a really interesting generation because it's weird things happen during this period. So probably the most important one is the baby boom, right? So most of the children, this generation that we call the baby boomers, right, who are massively important, and their impact on history, we can't understate it, and we'll talk about why when we talk about the baby boomers. The parents of the baby boomers, though, are mostly the silent generation, right? A little bit the greatest generation, but a lot of them is the silent generation, especially the older among the silent generation. So you get this massive spike in fertility following the end of the Second World War. And at first, demographers refer to it as, welcome home babies or hello babies. They think men returning from war, either returning to their wives or, coming back and getting married and having families very quickly causes a big spike in fertility. Now, demographers expected that this spike in fertility would end. They suspected, so it starts in 1945, 1946, and they said it'll probably end by about 1952, 1953. It actually continues until the beginning of the 1960s, ending somewhere around 1962, 1963. This will end up affecting kind of American and Canadian society in major ways right up until the present because of how many babies are born. And I have it on a slide in the next section, but I think it's in the US alone. the number of babies born between 1945 and 1962, 76 million. 76 million babies born in this period. So, I mean, to put it in kind of in context, that's more than the population of France today. So in this period, they essentially could have repopulated France almost entirely on just American babies. It's about half the population, a little bit more than half the population of the Russian Federation. You know, it's what, double the population of Canada. So if you took everyone in Canada alive today and doubled it, you roughly have how many people were born in the baby boom. And so it's caused a massive, massive impact. Yeah.
76 million in America or America and Canada?
That's just America, right? Canada goes through a similar boom, but it's a much smaller population, so you don't have nearly as many people born in Canada. But yeah, that's the United States alone. It's just 76 million in the US. So yeah, massive, massive population growth, lots of babies. And like I said, it lasts a lot longer than people thought. Now, what's it driven by? It seems to be driven by optimism, primarily, right? Optimism, basically that the future is going to get a lot better, especially in North America, right? Now, what's happening economically is you get some of the benefits. The economic history is a little bit complicated. Some of the benefits of things that were happening in the 1930s, right? The growth of the union movement and workers' rights in the 1930s means that the kind of economic system is very worker-oriented in the 1940s and 50s. And this will last all the way through the 70s. So you have very powerful trade unions, a lot of manufacturing jobs, and a world market that is desperate for goods from the United States and Canada. Why? Well, because, you know, twice in a 30-year span, Europe blew itself up, right? And basically, like, England is wrecked. The Germans did a nice job of bombing all of the industrial centers in England and the UK. So there's English industry is wrecked. France is destroyed. Germany is super destroyed. And Japan is destroyed, right? So essentially all of the major industrial powers of the pre-war period, other than the United States and Canada, are completely wrecked. Half of Europe is sitting behind the Iron Curtain under Soviet control. So you can take that off the board completely, right? So Poland, Czechoslovakia at the time, and all of the, the Balkans, all of it is in the kind of Bulgaria, Romania, all in the communist bloc. They weren't super industrial to begin with, but that's all off the board. And so the only place providing goods to the rest of the world as Europe rebuilds is the United States and Canada, because they're the only ones whose industrial base is intact. So this gives a ton of good paying jobs in factories, right? A lot of industrial manufacturing and a lot of the wartime economy, right, that was making, planes and tanks and guns and bullets gets shifted over to making civilian goods. So you get a ton of good paying jobs. What this does, right, and this is kind of generally true, a lot of good paying jobs with relatively little education, right? Once you're done high school, you have enough education to work in a factory, which means you can basically, marry your high school sweetheart and start a family at a relatively young age. And this is precisely what happened, your high school or college sweetheart. Reversing a trend that had been going up in terms of two things: age of first marriage and age of mother when their first child is born. Both of these things decline sharply in the post-war period. So, I mean, I read this in Jean Twenge's book, Generations, and it kind of struck me because I hadn't quite known it before. In the 1950s, right, and essentially all the way through the decade, and I think I said this earlier in the course, half of new brides, right, half of new brides, actually 52%, were 18 or 19, right? They're in their teens, right? So people are getting married very young, and you don't have. What ultimately brings the baby boom to an end is this, right? Is the invention of oral contraception, right? The birth control pill. Now it takes a little while, not actually that long. It comes out. The birth control pill is first kind of patented in 1957. It's approved by the FDA for limited use in 1957. And, basically, essentially for bleeding disorders, it becomes widely available as a contraceptive in 1960. And initially, there's some reluctance to approve it as a contraceptive because there's moral imperatives against contraception at the time. But the push for contraception is so strong socially. You can imagine if you've had 76 million babies in a 10-year period, people are probably sick of having kids. So you have this really strong push for it, and it's approved as a contraceptive in 1960. And this will ultimately cause a ton of changes. For one, it brings that baby boom to an end, right? By 1963, the numbers of births start to plummet. And by the early 1970s, I see your question. By the early 1970s, right, so about 1972, 1973, the birth rate drops below replacement, right, which is 2.1 children per woman. Yeah, Mia.
Were like the baby boomers that had like lots of children, like really big families, or was it just like a lot of people having like one kid?
So I think, if I recall, I have it written down somewhere else. I think the fertility peaks at about 3.8 children per woman in 1957 or 58. I'm not exactly sure. I have it written down in another section, which we'll look at. Increasingly looks like next week. But yeah, the average size of the family gets bigger, right? So people are having the average woman is having almost 4 children, right? So you can guarantee that there's some that are having less and some that are having quite a few more, right? But average family size would have been somewhere between 3 and 6 at the time, right? And that would have been really, really normal outside of, French, Canadian, Roman Catholics, like my mom's family that had 14. But, outside of that, such a weird thing generationally. But yeah, I've lost my train of thought. Where is it? All right, birth control, right? Anyway, it's really an interesting kind of period. We'll talk about the silence because this is mostly the silence, right, that are having these declines in marriage age and increases in fertility. And it's weird, right? It's a really weird kind of moment in history. It'll shape everything that comes after it. But up until then, for almost 200 years, age of first marriage and total fertility rate had been declining, right? Even before there was contraception available, we were trending towards, family sizes at around 2.5 children per woman. And then this moment hits, and it happens much more quickly than people thought, and it lasts a lot longer. And, it really is driven by economics, right? There's other things, and I'll talk about them because they are important. And one of the other things that I think allows people to have this many children, they move out to the suburbs, right? You move out of urban centers where you were living in apartments, out to suburbs where you're living in these small homes, right? Justin Trudeau wants to bring them back, right? The so-called war housing floor plans. But people move out to these homes that have, more space, a backyard, the white picket fence and all of that. That gives people the sense that they can have more children because they have more space. They're not crammed into urban cores. And you get the advent of, what allows this fertility boost at first, but then ultimately I think plays a big role in, women, you call the feminist movement or women's liberation, time-saving appliances, right? And you wouldn't want to understate these because they are super important to the transformation that's gone after. To the point where I've heard feminist scholars suggest that 2 inventions probably did more for women's liberation than any other 2 inventions in human history. And you might be surprised that one of them is the dishwasher and the other one is the laundry machine or the washing machine. And why? Well, principally because what used to be kind of considered women's domestic labor, right, which was doing the laundry and, cooking, cleaning, I guess the vacuum cleaners sometimes put there as well. All of these things become much, much easier. Now, just imagine, my mom used to have one of these when I was a kid. I don't know if they still exist anymore. It's like a washboard, right? Where basically you would put it in a tub of water and you would scrub each single piece of clothing that your family had, one at a time and then wring them out. My grandma had one of these, like the wringer machine where you would put it through 2 metal tubes and it would squeeze the water out of them. And you can imagine how time consuming that would be compared to throwing your crap in the washing machine, right? Leaving, going to do something else for an hour, coming back and then throwing it in the dryer, right? Or at the very least, hanging it up on the clothesline, right? All of these things create these huge extra amounts of time that women now don't have to spend on what Marxists would call the task of social reproduction, right? Keeping your family alive and keeping them clothed and all of that stuff becomes much simpler. Microwave plays a role as well, though I don't think as big as people thought. There was a big craze in the 1960s being like, women will never have to cook again. You'll just buy these frozen TV dinners from the store, and that's how you'll feed your family. Now that to me sounds like a fate worse than death. I can just think of like the Hungry Man dinners and eating that every day, and I kind of want to die inside. But I might be a little bit of a foodie at the end of the day. Spent like $1,000 on kitchen gadgets last year, so I don't know. I'm like, but what would I do with my blowtorch? I love making creme brulee. Can you microwave it? I don't know. But all of that stuff, right, gives this sense that women now can leave the domestic sphere and aren't sacrificing, a lot of these tasks because they're automated and they're much simpler. So that is a big deal. Okay. We'll talk about this, more when we talk about the silence and the boomers as well. Jean Twenge will contend that the period between 1960 and 1973 is one of enormous social tumult, right? And one that is ultimately extremely transformative in kind of Western societies, the United States in particular, Europe and Canada as well. Because, everything sort of changes in this decade, and there's so much happening. Now, this is mostly the silence, right? We're still talking mostly, most of the stuff that's happening is being driven by not the baby boomers, who are entering by the end of this decade, right, their 20s. By the end of the 1960s are entering their 20s, right? So middle part of the 1960s, the oldest of the boomers are just in their late teens. So most of what's happening through this period is driven by the silent generation still, right? That, the younger part, those born more towards the middle part of the early to middle part of the 1940s. But you have, a bunch of things that happen and a real push towards individuality that's really, really important. So things like, the Vietnam War, right? Very famously, right, the US enters the Vietnam War in 1961, essentially taking over the anti-communist struggle from the French, who had gone back to French Indochina after the war to reclaim their colony and been sort of told by the Vietnamese, we don't like you and we don't want you here. Who can blame them for kicking out the French? So the Vietnam War, kind of kicks off, and immediately people are being drafted to go serve in Vietnam. Combined with television, right, this ends up creating a really big problem because TV essentially shows people what's happening in Vietnam. So you get images on television, which is just a brand new technology in some ways, right, becomes really mainstream in about 1952, 1953. And more people by the 1960s have at least one television, and you get news reports, from Vietnam that are showing the bombing campaigns and men with, wounded men in hospitals and all of these things, which makes the war really, really unpopular with young people in the US. And if you contrast this to, say, a war that had happened just about a decade earlier, the Korean War, which went from 1950 to 1953, there's much more kind of social pushback against the war in Vietnam, even though both of them were framed as kind of anti-communist struggles. So you get this push, a much greater individuality and much greater kind of sense of not civil service and what can I do for my country as a patriot, but more like, why am I being forced to serve in an army and go fight when I don't want to? And I mean, you could think of Muhammad Ali, as one of the, again, a silent generation, as one of the fundamental figures here, because, he says, I don't want to go fight in Vietnam. I think he says he has no problem with these Vietnamese youth that want to run their country their own way, right? He doesn't want to go fight. His individuality says, this is nothing to do with me. And yeah, you get, I'm so out of time. I did so few slides today. So much interesting things happening in this period. Right, youth culture that emphasizes a rejection of patriarchal values and the repressed sexuality of the 50s especially. More sexual experimentation driven by the pill happens, and you get, right, an anti-war movement and a kind of popular culture movement in like hippie music and rock that really kind of pushes things in different directions. Okay, well, I'm now officially out of time. So I did what I could. Let's we'll meet up on Friday. We'll try to make more progress than I did today. I gotta shut up. No, actually, my job is to talk, so that wouldn't work at all. But I find the history of this period so incredibly interesting that I just want to share it all. All right, we'll see you on Friday.